That was terrific. Well, I'm just delighted to be here. From the broken city, you hear a lot about Washington. It's broken. It's terrible. We're caught in a bubble. Well, John, I think you did me a favor getting me out in the real world. So I'll begin to understand what in the world is going on with our politics. I'm so pleased to be here on the occasion of the formal launch of the Center. What a sterling idea to form this. I've had the now of meeting this dream team, the Heat. What? I mean, what? LeBron and Dwayne and Chris, you got 4 co-directors. That's impressive indeed. But if you really think about it, there are many, many scholarly reasons to pull this together, but I want to submit to you that there are reasons that go beyond the pursuit of knowledge, and that goes to grappling seriously with problems that confront our country and others as well. And I am very much struck by the way in which you put this together, the areas you've identified, the kind of problematics that you see out there, your determination to do good scholarship and to engage in some broader public debates is just a terrific thing. And before I proceed to talk about this wild and crazy election, the year of lunatics, I want to provide a charge to the new center. In fact, I had occasion over a nice lunch with colleagues here today to raise the question, which is, I think we have a sort of mega problem in our politics and policymaking these days. And I'll return to this at the very end of my remarks. We have a marvelous set of institutions, a constitutional design that's proven adaptable and taken us through 230 or so years as a republic, a great country, the superpower. In many respects, we have reasons to be quite pleased, and yet, God, we're in a foul mood about how we govern ourselves and or how they try to govern us, and not appropriately. I think we've hit a point. And John, I want you guys to go to work on this, all of you, which is the potential of a mismatch between our political parties and party system, our political culture on the one hand, the broad environment, and our political institutions on the other. As shorthand, we have parliamentary-like political parties trying to operate in a separation of powers systems with what has become now a routine supermajority requirement in the Senate, and what we've always had, a set of midterm elections proceeding barely 2 years after a presidential election with an electorate that is always very different from the electorate that preceded it. I think the combination of the two have actually done real damage to the democratic accountability in this country. And maybe in the course of our time together this afternoon, we can talk a bit more about that. But first, on to the election. I've been traveling some abroad, and people just come up to me and in the audiences, and they, what's going on over there? You know, what is it? 2 years ago, you made history. You elected the first African-American president. It was a landslide. It was change, and yes, we can. And now it's all gone, and the Tea Party has risen up, and America isn't the America we know. What in the world is going on? So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit here today.
I first want to apologize for my attire. To put you in the spirit of the election, I had intended to wear my Nazi reenactment uniform, but I left a damn thing at the cleaners and didn't get it out in time. Like many of you, I suppose, I've been watching the lead up to the rally to restore sanity and or fear, which is now the shorthand for the Stewart Colbert rally in my town coming up on Saturday, which of course had as a model to emulate Glenn Beck's rally to restore honor earlier in the fall. I mean, we're coming to the point where a fake news cable program and a crazy Fox News cable network commentator have become the dominant features in our political system. Very interesting development. This is also the year of course, the Tea Party and some of its candidates. None of us will ever forget the opening line of the first ad of the Republican nominee from the great state of Delaware, "I am not a witch." You remember that? Of course, Chris Coons, the Democratic nominee, responded quickly. He knew an opportunity when he saw it, and he began his ad by saying, "I am not Christine O'Donnell." And that there guaranteed a victory for the Democratic team. It's a year in which money seems to have been playing an overwhelming role in our politics. Meg Whitman, former CEO, has thus far invested $150 million out of her own purse in a quest to become governor of the greatest failed state in the world. Now you have to ask yourself, why? All I can say is Californians are grateful because she has done more to stimulate the California economy than anything else. You know, as she was spending those dollars, I was reminded of an experience I had many years ago, visiting a sort of political gathering in West Virginia. Jay Rockefeller was then governor of the state, and I saw him and I felt as if, and said to him in this reception, "I feel as if you're a part of my family. I know you." The reason being, every night there were Jay Rockefeller commercials on Washington television because it could pick up, you know, a micro component of the West Virginia electorate. He was spending big bucks. Back then that meant $1 million or $2 million, not 150, but it was big money in those times. John Racy, the very person who is running for the Senate from West Virginia as a Republican, although he lives in Florida, but that's another story, was running against Jay Rockefeller, and while Racy came from a family of means, you know, he saw this money as just overwhelming. The best thing he did in the campaign was to put out a bumper sticker which read, "Make him spend it all," which wouldn't be a bad thing for Jerry Brown to do, which brings me back to California. Our colleague and your professor, John Geer, has written much that is wise and insightful about political advertising and the effectiveness of negative ads oftentimes in conveying information and really being quite effective. But John, I have given the best campaign ad award to an ad that you might say is negative, but is really quite amazing. It's a Jerry Brown ad. I don't know if you've seen it, but it begins with a video clip of Meg Whitman, maybe from one of her ads. She said, "I came to California 30 years ago, and let me tell you, back then, this was a workable state. Person could get started in business, you know, and really grow the economy and provide jobs. It was wonderful." Then the clip stops, and and it says, who was governor 30 years ago in California? None other than Jerry Brown, the candidate for governor this time around. Cut taxes, improve the educational system, created opportunities for new entrepreneurs. Let's go back to that time. Meg Whitman thinks it was a good time. I'll bring back my record. It was a brilliant commercial, a comparative ad maybe, but it was really quite good. We pretty much think we know what's going to happen next Tuesday, and I don't have any thunderbolts to share with you. I thought about getting your attention by saying that, contrary to all evidence, I thought Democrats would pick up 30 seats in the House and 7 in the Senate and win a few governorships and state legislatures, but I figured you probably wouldn't believe me and might not even listen to me any further. We've improved to some extent our analytic capacity within the media. We have websites like 538.com with able people doing serious work to try to understand, looking from the top down and the bottom up, and we have so much evidence suggesting that it would be truly a shock if Republicans did not make major gains in the House and the Senate. It would be contrary to every experience we have had and observed in the course of American history. But it's important to acknowledge that just because that's almost certain to happen doesn't mean it's guaranteed to happen. This is not one national election. This is a host of 36 Senate and almost 435 contests. We still have some uncontested and very many gubernatorial and state legislative elections, and certainly there are areas of uncertainty. One of those areas of uncertainty is trying to figure out who's going to actually turn up at the polls, either through early voting, absentee, or on election day itself. I want you to know within the last week, we've had up to a dozen polling organizations that have given us the so-called generic vote for the House of likely voters. At one end is Newsweek, Princeton Research Associates, a group that used to be associated with the Gallup company. They have Democrats actually leading by 2 or 3 points. They're the only polling organization that has shown Democrats ahead, but we again had another poll today from McClatchy that showed a dead heat between the parties. They then go up. Some have it at 3 for the Republicans. The median is about 6 to 7. And we go up a little further. Then we get Rasmussen, which sort of people feel is sort of may have a little Republican bias to it. It's an automatic telephone poll, but it's about 10. And then way up here is Gallup. The gold-plated Gallup has a 14-point Republican lead in the generic vote. If that came true, we would be returning to numbers, swing in the vote that we haven't seen since the 1920s, 1890s. I mean, we're talking a swing of 100 seats or 80 seats. It's a little hard to believe that that anything like that could happen. A more reasonable forecast is, a point forecast is somewhere around 50 seats. The Republicans need 39 to get a majority. In my own mind, I sort of have a band that I've had for a long time, sort of 35 to 50, but it's sort of moved up. The range has moved. I think there's maybe a 1 in 5 chance that the Democrats would hold on. There's also a 1 in 5 chance that this could be 60 seats or more, and the rest sort of fall into that area that I've discussed, between 40 and 60, with somewhere around 50 the likelihood. We don't know. Many factors are concerned, as in addition to the nature of the electorate itself. But that's our best guess of what's going to happen. In the Senate, we can see there's only one Republican seat that's at all at risk, and it shouldn't be. It's from the clearly Republican state of Kentucky, and it's one of those cases where the Tea Party candidate, Rand Paul, ousted the Republican favorite, who would have won hands down, and now there's a more competitive race. Got a little more competitive yesterday when one of his staff organizers in an event sort of tackled a protester from MoveOn.org and then placed his foot on her head, and so that's become. I mean, it's important we discuss these big issues in the campaign. So, in any case, there are about 13 Democratic House seats that have been in play. A couple have now moved into pretty safe territory, and with California now very likely to be retained by the Democrats in the Senate seat as well as the governorship, and with a number of other seats that seem to be tipping Republican but falling very much into play, including West Virginia and Colorado. And now with this bizarre events in Alaska, where Joe Miller, the Republican nominee, as a consequence of defeating the incumbent, Lisa Murkowski, in the primary by a relatively small margin, is now facing two things. One, Murkowski running as a write-in candidate, and two, Mr. Wilson just completely self-destructing with a series of lies, and then saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I did lie," and bizarre statements and positions that, in the latest poll now shows him sinking dramatically, and actually Murkowski in the lead, but the Democratic candidate McAdams not far behind. Some Democrats were thinking of voting strategically just to keep Miller as far from Washington as possible. Murkowski is a good senator as well. But now it looks as if Wilson has taken himself out, and so you may actually get a very, very competitive race with the Democrats able to pick up that seat. Anyways, I still can't believe that Sharon Angle can be elected to the United States Senate. I mean, I'm old-fashioned, and I think there's a sanity test involved on these things, but I should know better. I've studied congressional history, right, Bruce? So, in any case, the odds are that Republicans would fall short in the Senate. It would be quite a stunner if they didn't. It would mean that the sort of differential turnout of the two camps is even greater than we've anticipated, and you get a tipping effect in all these races that could produce the 10. But I'm guessing it's going to be fall well short of that. Could be 6 or 7. In any case, it looks as if we're going to have not just divided party government, but a divided chamber as far as party control, and as well as substantial pickups for the Republicans in the governorships and the state legislative races, which are important on many grounds. First and foremost, they'd actually make policy and implement federal policies and are very much a part of our democracy. they also play around in redistricting, which is coming up this cycle. Now, should we be surprised by these huge gains that we are anticipating on Tuesday for the Republican Party? Some argue that it's Barack Obama's fault. He has squandered the opportunity that was afforded him with his election in 2008. But old fuddy-duddies like me think that's kind of silly and think that these huge Republican gains were really entirely predictable on sort of three simple and obvious facts. One, the traditional loss of seats by the president's party at midterm and the differential composition of the electorates in presidential and congressional elections. Two, the number of Democratic seats at risk, which is unusually high because of the two major electoral victories the Democrats enjoyed in 2006 and 2008, and a really dreadful economy, objectively and subjectively. It's hard to imagine more pessimistic accounts of the economy and its future coming from the public, but it's real. We have gone through a very serious financial and economic crisis that could have landed us in a depression. But what Americans see is, hey, this is bad. We're unemployed. Members of our family, if not us, or our close network of friends, our hours are down, our income is down, our private assets have diminished, and we don't see much of a prospect. If you need any other reason for the public to be scared and sour and pessimistic, I think you underestimate the extent of the economic damage that was done of the public. Given those circumstances, there should be no surprise that Barack Obama's approval rating is down. Right now, it's about 45%. About this time in 1982 with Ronald Reagan in a recession, it was lower. It bottomed out about 34% in early 1983. Before the election, it was just tipping into the 30s. Bill Clinton's approval rating about this time was a little lower than Obama's was as well. That was only partly economics, but we still hadn't. That was another recent recession, which wasn't long or deep, but the jobs didn't come forward, and real economic activity until later in Clinton's term. So the fact is, historically, no president has stayed popular when the economy's in serious trouble, and it then gets reflected in a whole host of indicators and gets caught up. But in my town of Washington, that would just be a pretty boring story if that's all you told. So of course we analyze, what really explains what we call the Obama paradox, which is, in purely objective terms, this administration has achieved a record of passing major legislation that is challenged only by Lyndon Johnson and Franklin Roosevelt. It's really quite extraordinary if you look at the magnitude of the stimulus and the pieces to it, the health reform, the financial regulatory reform, add in the sort of transformation of the student loan program, and then you begin to get to sort of second-tier matters. It's really quite extraordinary, a set of accomplishments. But as we all know, there have been no political dividends that have accrued to the president as a consequence of these achievements. So the question becomes, well, why not? Why not? One explanation is, hey, we're supposed to say the stimulus worked when we got $9.6 unemployment. We don't see it getting better. Americans, aren't thinking ahead 5, 10 years, even 2 years. Understandably, they're reacting to the here and now. But the arguments that were forthcoming were of a very different sort about his problem. Inflated campaign promises and expectations. Well, sure. He promised to deliver a post-partisan politics. That was kind of silly, naive. When you have a degree of partisan polarization that we have that's been building since the 1960s and took root from those seeds planted in the 60s and the 70s and grew so that over the last decade it is a profound polarization between the parties. The idea that by reaching out he was going to turn that around was genuinely naive, or maybe he just felt he had to do it because, after all, that was his signature brand. Remember you're too young. 2004, Democratic National Convention, Boston. Barack Obama, no one ever heard of him. He's the keynote speaker. I was in the auditorium. I still remember. Others here were. We are not a nation of red states and blue states. We are the United States of America. It was electrifying, and that became his signature brand. He pushed that with opposition to the war in Iraq into the Democratic presidential nominating battle, bested Hillary Clinton and went on to win the nomination, and continued that theme because people liked hearing it. They don't like seeing these fights and this bitterness and ugliness, even if they contribute to it with the pattern of voting and political activity that they engage in. But the reality is the Republicans announced their opposition, their unwillingness to engage in negotiation before the president was inaugurated, in spite of being in the midst of an economic crisis. It tells you something about our party system that we don't have the capacity to rally very long. It lasted for a couple of months after 9/11, but basically we have such fundamentally different sets of values and beliefs. As one of your own professors, Mark Hetherington, has described, that is really quite profound and stays with us. And you can't expect it to disappear. The incentives push toward opposition, not toward working together. Misguided priorities. He didn't focus like a laser on the economy and went off on other silly things like health care and education reform. Well, he got a stimulus through in 3 weeks. That was pretty quick. He was deeply involved during the transition on the financial stabilization program, which had been approved, thank God, under George Bush's administration near the end. He was deeply involved in that. Yeah, you could criticize him for saying he undershot on the stimulus. Instead of $787 billion, which in reality has a bunch of filler that the couple of Republicans and reluctant Democrats who voted to break a filibuster in the Senate insisted on. It was more like a $700 billion package. But maybe Krugman is right and we needed $1.5 trillion or 1.2 or 1.3, and that would have given us the oomph, Keynesian style, to get out of it. But with Republicans unitedly opposing the smaller package, and it was like pulling teeth to try to get someone to join the 58 Democrats to overturn the filibuster, that the odds of him getting a bigger package are really quite low. And after that package passed, the politics were such that it was almost impossible to get anything else, although there were packages introduced again and again. Ideological overreach, that was the problem. and this is a favorite of Washingtonians, it's all described by ideology, and ideological positioning. The champions of this are pollsters Mark Penn and Doug Schoen. It's absolutely predictable. Everything, Bill Clinton, he went too far left when he began his presidency, and then after he lost, he moved to the center. I mean, it sounds good, but if we start parsing that, looking at the evidence, seeing what he did in his first year versus his third year and the like, it doesn't quite look like that. Was the health care an ideological overreach? Is this socialized medicine, a government takeover? Death panels? Was it too much for America to absorb, and in this economic crisis led to a great deal of fear about government just taking on so much? No question, low trust in government. People were scared, and when the attacks were made on this, they really came to believe much of it. If you unpack it, they think in general the pieces of it were pretty good. Many of them had Republican pedigrees. It was a bill that looked very much like the Republican alternative to the Clinton package in 1993 and 94. I think the ideological overreach argument just doesn't hold water at all. If you talk to the members of the policy community, health policy community, if you looked at the groups that have been working outside and inside Congress for years, it was perfectly within the mainstream of American politics. Tactical failures in dealing with Congress, communications breakdown, no compelling narrative. Yeah, there wasn't. You can go back and see speeches that were really good, but Barack Obama did not pound every day with a phrase that would help sell the stimulus, sell the health care reform. You're right, he doesn't operate like that. Would that have made a difference? I doubt it. But maybe it is. In my view, this is patrolling at the margins. The fall from grace of Barack Obama and the Democratic Party is perfectly predictable based on the severe economic conditions Americans faced. And to return to a theme I introduced at the very beginning, the nature of the political struggle to make public policy in these times when a minority party has strong incentives against negotiating because they hold perhaps the pivotal vote to deny a filibuster. In fact, rather than producing negotiations at some kind of policy setter, it did just the opposite. Republicans were guaranteed to get even more Republican elements to this bill if any of them were willing to play, and they were invited to do so. But the pressure on the handful that wanted to from the leadership was so intense that it did not happen. In my view, then, it's not surprising at all. There is no paradox. The drop in his support, he got 53% of the vote. 53% of the vote in 2008, big victory. He now has 45% approval ratings. That's not a tumultuous fall. It went up, of course, as it always does after inauguration, but in my own view, it's much more modest. It's to be expected, and it tells us more about the objective economic conditions and the nature of our political institutions and party system than it tells us a whole lot about presidential leadership. Ronald Reagan was a great communicator. Bill Clinton was, but it wasn't sufficient. Let me make two quick observations and then turn to your questions. If we get the results we expect to get, what do we expect? How's the next 2 years going to be as far as governing? There is a There is a story, and a credible scholarly story, about legislative productivity under times of divided party government. David Mayhew was the first to write and study this systematically, and in fact, divided government has on occasion produced agreement on important matters. My view is that is highly unlikely to happen for a couple of reasons. One is the fact that Republicans have followed a strategy of unified party opposition, and it's worked. It's worked brilliantly. And why would they abandon something that worked? That's number one. And number two is their supporters, their Tea Party activists, their aligned interest groups are already laying down the markers of we will not compromise. And among Tea Partiers, the overwhelming sentiment is to stand by your principle and not compromise, even though our whole Madisonian system was based on the notion of compromise. It seems to me under these circumstances, even in areas where there might be some grounds for agreement on education reform, reauthorizing No Child Left Behind, on clean energy research and development. If we can't put a price on carbon, let's at least have a sort of a major government investment, as we did in the precursor to the internet, on clean energy. Republicans believe in that, and yet my guess is, in the end, denying the president any victories is the most important thing. Mitch McConnell interviewed 2 days ago and asked, what's your highest priority for this next 2 years? He said, to ensure that Mr. Obama is a one-term president. I mean, he just sort of laid it out pretty clearly, and I don't see dynamics. I think we have the potential, even though John Boehner knows better, he's a good legislator, but I don't think he's going to be able to control his troops. We're going to have a government shutdown, or we're raising the debt limit, or efforts to defund the Department of Health and Human Services insofar as it tries to implement the Health Reform Act. It will be vetoed. And my guess is, like the Republican Congress under Newt Gingrich in 1995 and early 96, the Republican Congress will not blink, and at least initially, and we're going to shut down government. It's going to be a period of great confrontation, which means Barack Obama is going to de-emphasize Congress over the next 2 years. His whole fate was tied to Congress, and as the least popular institution in America, that tended to drag him down as well. Look for huge emphasis on foreign policy, on executive orders, on the administrative process, on initiatives taken with the private sector and business to try to spark additional investment and innovation. Look for some confrontational fights with Congress over immigration and other such matters, but not a period of constructive governance. And finally, what does it all mean for the presidential election and the long-term position of the political parties? I think it matters very little. Ronald Reagan, after his midterm loss, won a landslide re-election with economic recovery. Bill Clinton won a comfortable victory after feeling the need to say, I'm still the president and I am not irrelevant after the Republican takeover. Barack Obama will be reelected if two things happen. One, he doesn't face a primary challenge for renomination because of Democratic discontent over the war in Afghanistan. And two, if the economy picks up enough, 3% annual growth in GDP, unemployment rate coming slowly but relentlessly down. I think under those circumstances and under conditions in the Republican Party where the Tea Party influence is likely to pull its candidates further to the right, the prospects are reasonably good for him. But that doesn't mean politics and policy making is good. We are entering and had been in a period of the politics of austerity. It will increase. It will change the whole dynamic of politics as we're allocating some pain to Americans who've absorbed quite a bit already. It will be a very difficult period, and we have to navigate it through this structural realignment that I discussed at the beginning, the misalignment between our political institutions and the party system that feeds into it. Thank you very much. Now, I would love to hear from you and see if we can have a little schmooze here, huh? John, okay? Who would like to ask the first question? If no one does, who would like to ask the second question? Someone right here. There you are, please.
Okay, you emphasize that Democrats will lose seats because of the bad economy, and the same would happen with Republicans. But because the parties initially divided back in the 60s due to racial relations and civil rights, do you think that Obama pledging cooperative politics, or even just the fact that he's a black president, has served to inflame those sentiments from the 60s?
It's a good question. Is Obama's race and promises of reconciliation have those become an obstacle? In general, I think not. If you ask me, there's sort of two things. One, a traditional white male sitting in the White House would be having the same drop in popularity as Barack Obama is having. There's just no question about it. The second thing is, and this is really important to remember, is the different composition of the electorate. I've been trying to find out, and I got back to my email and had a couple of exchanges. The polls haven't been very good about this nationally, but it looks as if for some of the polls that show a really big likely voter victory for the Republicans, if you ask those voters who they voted for in 2008, it's John McCain. That is, it's an electorate showing up that's roughly 30% compared to 60+% in 2008 that voted for John McCain. So you don't need big changes in the electorate. It's a question of who shows up. You know what a big part of that is? A huge part of Obama's popular vote margin was provided by young voters, 18 to 29. They are the lowest turnout age cohort. That's been true historically, but there has been an increase in turnout in recent years, but they tend to fall off even more than other voters do from presidential to midterm. Now they are disproportionately Democratic and supportive of Obama, but their presence in the electorate relative to people like me, seniors, 65 and older, who love to vote and have a lot of time on their hands, and in fact are the ones who've reacted very negatively to Obama. It's interesting, there may be some modest racial element, but it's just, he looks different, and it's a little scary, but it's mainly health reform. It's a fear that in this reform, they heard there were going to be cuts in Medicare. Well, it turns out there was savings in Medicare off the projected increases, most of which are a consequence of cutting off the additional payments for Medicare Advantage, managed care option. But the fear is intense, and they have become overwhelmingly Republican. So just changing the composition of that electorate, plus the economy, almost over describes the decline in his standing and as a consequence of the Democrats' standing. Yes, sir.
I understand what you're saying about how that different parties try to block legislation Republicans gain control of Congress, isn't there some incentive for them to pass legislation? And isn't there an incentive for President Obama to want to pass legislation as well? And isn't there some incentive for them to work together that both parties want to try to achieve in 2012?
Well, that would seem like the logic, but, you know, you could argue that after Newt Gingrich's Republicans lost badly in the political standoff with Bill Clinton, they eventually got around to working out agreement on a number of pieces of legislation, including welfare reform. So there was a period of some agreement, although Clinton vetoed the first two welfare bills they put forward. Remember, welfare reform was one of Clinton's signature issues when he ran for Congress. He could have enacted that in his first year if he had chosen to take that on. There was also a Insurance Portability Act, Kassebaum, Kennedy bill. 1997, there was a, quote, balanced budget agreement, but that was marginal. The big savings to turn deficits into surpluses under Clinton came from two major deficit reduction packages, one foisted upon the first President Bush, and the second done without a single Republican vote in 1993. The reconciliation package had a much bigger impact than, as CBO has scored it, than the 97 package. By 97, the economy was growing. The rise in the tax rate at the very highest income bracket was getting revenues from those who were greatly increasing their income. It was boom time, revenues were high, and the budget was balanced by the time that act passed, and mainly that cut taxes and projected some savings in Medicare that never came by. Listen, McConnell and Boehner are thinking, gee, if we reach some agreement, President Obama's going to look better, and we want him out. We want both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. We don't just want one. And very interestingly, the Congress is oftentimes judged, is not judged by its productivity, what they get done. I mean, look at this last 2 years. The public doesn't have any appreciation for truly historic accomplishments. It didn't do the Democrats in Congress any good to pass that. No, I think the calculation is make it look really bad. Make people be unhappy, and they'll be in 2012. They will still be thinking Barack Obama. He's in charge. He brought all of this on. That mobilizes Republican votes, gets some straight party votes. I think that's the logic. Yeah, Obama has an incentive, but if they don't want to do a deal, you can't do a deal, and he's certainly not going to embrace outright Republican policies after his election and his agenda. So I am deeply skeptical that the incentives for cooperation are greater than the clear incentives for confrontation. I also just think if you look at the fervor of the supporters and the belief, and in some ways it's so sad. On the one hand, it's just legitimate fear and concerns. I mean, government did have to take on things that were quite extraordinary with the auto companies, with the banks, with taking over AIG. Seeing all of this big government is kind of scary, and so the idea, let's cut spending and limit government, but they're living in a fantasy world. They're not going where the money is. The surveys have been very clear on this among the people. They want to get rid of earmarks. Hooray! Let's get rid of earmarks. That gets us about 1% of the budget. It doesn't even get you that because all it does is change the allocation formula. Instead of some members of Congress steering funds, you'll leave it you leave it to the executive branch. And as I learned from research work of one of your graduate students, presidents are pretty influential in the distribution of discretionary grant funds, in steering it in ways, not to individuals, but to states that are important in the upcoming presidential election. So the sad thing is just how escapist this whole debate is. I mean, what do you mean you're going to cut spending? What are you going to cut? And what do you mean we can't do it by touching Social Security or Medicare? That's where you rob banks because that's where the money is. If you're really concerned about spending, you're concerned about two things. One, the drivers of the budget on the spending side, which are our social insurance programs, and mainly medical cost inflation. Social Security is a very small part of it, but the other is revenues. And revenues are important in two respects. Sort of one, sort of rates that we have, the tax rates. There's no question that the tax cuts approved in 2001 and 2002 have added a couple of $1 trillion to our debt. And so tax rates matter. And the same movement wants to cut taxes as well. The second thing we've learned is that the level of growth in the economy determines the flow of revenues into the budget. And if the economy is underperforming, inadequate demand and investment, and you move to an immediate austerity program, then you further weaken the economy, which further reduces revenues, which can overwhelm any kind of immediate savings you have. That's what Greece is going through right now. That's what Ireland has done. Portugal and Spain are facing the same thing. And the UK has just taken a real risk in beginning a process of cutbacks that they estimate will eventually be 25%. And they're doing it right away, and their economy is in terrible shape. It's worse than ours. Some of these European countries are doing it because of they can't float the financing to cover their shortfalls and revenues and to roll over their debt. They have no credibility. Greece is facing 10% interest rate demands. You know what our long-term interest rates are? 2.5%. They've never, seldom in our history, been lower. This is not the time. There's no little room for the Fed to act. They're going to try quantitative easing to help, but the fact is, if you were being responsible, you would say what we need is some immediate, additional short-term stimulus. But it needs to be coupled with larger changes in the tax system and particularly in healthcare that will come into effect as the economy picks up steam and it is growing. That's when you can begin to do the cutbacks. But there's no appreciation of that fact out there among the citizens who are rightly concerned about what's going on and have a notion of what makes sense. Think of it as household. When times are tough, you pull back. You spend less. You try to accumulate a little savings to last through, and we naturally apply that to government. That's what Keynes called the paradox of thrift, and it produces a downward spiral of the economy. It doesn't help. We need counter-cyclical spending. But then we do have a long-term fiscal problem, but it's going to be hard for people to face the reality of what's involved. We're going to have to tax differently and more, and we're going to have to and we need desperately the health reform plan that was passed and was panned because it builds in a number of initiatives that offer some promise of transforming the way in which we pay for health services and the way in which we deliver health services. Without doing that, we don't have a chance of getting on top of this thing. So it's really sad that discussions like this are not taking place in town hall meetings. I mean, some of you may disagree with me, and that's fine. Let's hear it. Let's talk about it and try to parse the evidence. But that doesn't happen anymore because people are in one camp or another. Senator Moynihan, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, had many famous sayings. One of them was, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own facts. No longer true. Everyone has their own facts. Facts are not objective realities. Facts are conceptions of reality that are just fundamentally different. I sit and I listen to TV, I listen to speeches in Congress, and I hear this nonsense, this escapism. So how do we get our political institutions arranged in a way in which genuine differences and problems can be aired and discussed and debated, and an electorate can get educated in a way to see what the actual choices are that we confront? That's what you folks are going to take care of. I'm going back to Washington. Yes?
You referenced Reagan's popularity a couple times in '82 and how he came back from that. But when we came out of that recession, we were having robust 6-8% GDP growth in the quarter. And right now, even if we have 3% coming out of this, that's not going to, if maybe marginally improve our unemployment rate. If we have 9% unemployment, and that's not even taking into account, we could have a number of global shocks originating either in Europe, China, Japan, whatnot, plunge to the double dip. If we have 9%, 10% unemployment in 2012, can Obama A, continue to blame Bush for the economy and be win re-election?
No and no. He's dead meat. As I said, there's two things that he needs to win re-election. And a Tea Party-supported Republican nominee would just be frosting on the cake. He needs no challenge to his renomination for the presidency, which means the kind of movement that developed in the Democratic Party over the war in Iraq, which in part he benefited from, can't develop on Iraq, on Afghanistan. And right now, that's a big question. Support for our engagement is plummeting, especially among Democrats, but among some Republicans as well. And therefore, it was no surprise that when Obama decided to increase our forces, he set a date for the beginning of the withdrawal of forces, signaling that this was limited. He was criticized by people who said, well, that just tells them to wait it out. Well, actually, that same situation applied in Iraq, and we're getting out of there. Hey, we can't build stable democracies very well and impose it with military force, and doing counterinsurgency and economic development is a task we're finding quite difficult. In any case, that is the one thing he needs, no challenge, and therefore look at this review of Afghan policy in December and signals as to what's going to happen in June or July. But the second is a healthy enough economy. It's not going to be anything like that extraordinary surge. That was definitely a V-shaped surge because it was a recession created by Paul Volcker of the Fed to try to get a hold of severe inflation. And once that was done, you just turn open the spigots and the economy was ready to grow. So you're right. It was stunning how quickly that economy came back, starting really in mid to late 1983, so that in early 1984 there was a sense of vitality in the country. And it may, if we're falling into a period now with all of this continuing instability in the global financial system, if we fail through the G20 coming up next month, to really reach some agreement to begin to rebalance our economies in the global system, which are hard because it means China and Germany have to stimulate domestic demand and ease off the exports, and we have to cool down sort of consumer activity and try to reorganize our economy with much heavier investment and exports. And it's really tough in this environment. So yeah, one perfectly plausible scenario for 2012 is an economy that doesn't bounce back enough to give people hope that things are really improving, and that Obama has put in place a program that moves us in that direction. Without that, he's dead. Boy, if you add to that a very unpopular, seemingly unending war in Afghanistan, he certainly will be a one-term president. Overlooking foreign policy issues, were you saying? It's understandable. I mean, the economy is just such a dominant concern to people in their everyday lives. Listen, they see the foreign policy connection in the international economics, but most of it scares them because they see the contagion effects. Remember, we started having a pretty lively economy. End of 2009, the first quarter of 2010, we had 5% and 3.7% GDP growth. The loss of private jobs stopped, and we started adding them. The White House began to relax a little, feeling we got this baby all worked out, we had it figured out, and then we had a financial crisis in Greece, and it spread to other countries and over to ours, and money stayed put. $2 trillion in cash reserves by companies stayed in cash reserves, and what we thought was going to be a turnaround never developed. The point is, Americans have every reason to be concerned about the economy, but I think they see the global aspects of it. On other matters, the reason they're not engaged is because there's no elite debates on the issues. On Afghanistan, Republicans like what President Obama has done, and Democrats are wary, but the last thing they want to do before a midterm election is criticize their president, which would hurt them. So they've kept quiet on that for now. They won't after the election. Iran, all sides are pretty happy with how things are going with the policy. Our efforts in Asia to sort of rally South Korea and Japan, India, Vietnam, and some pushback on their behalf with China, and a tougher line toward China is actually quite popular at both parties, and you're not getting real differences articulated by elites, which is how you get publics to begin thinking more and more engaged in foreign policy. But my view is, assuming the economy does begin to recover, that you will see a return to some foreign policy issues to the attention of the public. Yeah?
You kind of have indirectly touched on this thus far, but historically speaking, on the party level, in what ways has the campaign strategy been different for congressional elections between the midterm election year and the year in which there's a president's election also occurring? And what implications, if any, does that have for not only this election, but the election in 2012?
You know, for me, someone who did his dissertation on congressional elections, and studied those early on. The focus, the discovery was the extent to which members had the capacity, individual members, to build their own reputations, quite apart from the underlying partisan structure of their districts, and develop reputations and gather resources that allowed them to survive better some waves that might blow across the electorate. The most profound change during this period has been the growing importance of party in almost every respect. It's really quite stunning for me to see this. The party campaign committees used to be absolutely irrelevant to members. Now they are major funders of congressional campaigns. They do it because of the law independently. It's just nonsense. But they have to engage in independent expenditures. But now you hear talks of the party's cutting off this candidate and that candidate. 30 years ago, 20 years ago even, what? They don't have anything to cut off. Now they're sort of major players, but it also means that as a consequence, there are more seats potentially in play, because in the old days, the advantages of incumbency were such that they kept the numbers really small. Now, the underlying structure is there's enough play in probably 100 districts based on the underlying sort of number of Democrats and Republicans. That means 3/4 there's not, and those are very lopsided, one-sided districts. But it does mean that strategically, members think more in terms of their party and not just in terms of themselves. So they play both of them. And in a midterm election, it means and you're seeing these members that are Democrats run against Obama and say, I won't vote for Nancy Pelosi and so on. Most of those are dead meat. They're just going down, and that's not going to help them one bit, because they happen to be in mainly Republican districts, and they're getting swept out. Ironically, in many cases, they would have been better by working together to try to sell these policies and make them more credible. But in a presidential election, versus a midterm, you think very much about the composition of the electorate, because you know how different it is, and you worry a lot about fall-off and among what constituents, and so in some ways get out the vote efforts are even more important, but they may not pay dividends. By the way, I have a constitutional amendment for you. I don't usually approve of amending the Constitution, but look south. Australia is a wonderful country. And I recommend you all travel there and visit Canberra, the capital, but mainly Sydney and Melbourne and Tasmania. It's gorgeous. But one of the sensible things they did some years ago is set up a system, prepare yourself for this, mandatory voting. Everybody votes. Vote, you pay a penalty or write a letter explaining. I mean, it's not a big pain, and if you want to vote none of the above or just go to the polls and turn in an empty ballot, you can do that. But the idea is, hey, in a democracy, everyone plays. And it's had a dramatic effect. I mean, number one, it's now built into the educational system. Everyone knows that everyone's going to vote, and so people are actually prepared. A return to civic education, shocking. People learn something about their government. But secondly, the games of mobilization, demobilization are not part of what's going on. You don't worry about dramatic changes in the composition of the election or try to influence it. I mean, you're still looking at swing districts and swing voters, but it's a very different exercise. And if we had that, our politics would change in a really fundamental way. And any politician who proposed doing it would be beheaded, by some political movement, just outraged at the invasion of privacy and personal freedom. So I don't expect it to happen, but it's a useful exercise to go through and thinking about, sometimes we get a little full of ourselves that we must have the best of all possible political systems and constitutional arrangements and systems of election administration, right? Florida, November 2000, and campaign finance. And, well, it turns out, we're not so great. We have strengths, but now we discover we have weaknesses, and we've got to be prepared to face up to them and look around the world and learn something. We rank at the bottom among the major democracies in our healthcare provision. The cost is way above anyone else, and the outcomes for the whole population are mediocre. Take that. Our educational record is 15th, 17th on this, 18th on this. The number of scientists, engineers we produce on a per capita basis places us well beneath the leadership. And we could go on, Let's pull up our socks and get these things together. We have enormous assets, but we got to figure out a way to govern ourselves and to face up to the problems and get the job done. We've done it in the past when we faced crises, but somehow now instead we're caught up in this mindless, banal ideological debate that doesn't address any of these problems. It's very discouraging, and we ought to recognize it, speak out, and tell ourselves to shape up and tell them to shape up. Don't give me this nonsense, Come on, Tom, say what you really think.
Well, I think on that note, we are going to thank Tom for bringing very